In 1828, an Edinburgh undertaker's assistant could point a stranger toward a fresh grave for a fee and never once break the law because a corpse legally belonged to nobody at all. William Burke and William Hare turned that loophole into 16 confirmed murders. Number 3 on this list, armed grieving families with guns to guard their own dead overnight. Number 1 meant a body could be legally buried without a doctor ever confirming death. None of this was scandal. It was ordinary trade knowledge, taught apprentice to apprentice. Subscribe now, because every practice on this list would end a modern funeral director's career. Number 10, mixing your own arsenic embalming fluid. Before formaldehyde became standard in the late 19th century, undertakers preserved bodies with homemade solutions built around arsenic and sometimes mercury, mixed with alcohol and spices to slow decomposition and keep a corpse presentable for viewing. There was no standard recipe, no safety training, and no license required to buy the raw poison in bulk, which meant the same jug used to embalm a body could sit in an undertaker's workroom within easy reach of anyone who mistook it for something else entirely. Newspapers of the era occasionally reported grieving families accidentally poisoning themselves after drinking leftover embalming fluid they assumed was cider or spirits. Teaching a modern apprentice to formulate an arsenic-based preservative today would violate poison control law, workplace safety regulation, and public health statutes simultaneously, which is exactly why the entire recipe vanished from the trade within decades of formaldehyde's arrival. Number 9, hiring children to march as professional mourners. Victorian funerals, especially the elaborate ones that became fashionable after Prince Albert's death, employed paid mutes, men and children dressed in black who stood motionless or walked slowly beside the coffin for hours to visibly amplify the household's grief. Children as young as 6 or 7 were dressed in miniature black mourning clothes and positioned at the graveside or along the procession route, purely for visual effect, sometimes for multiple funerals in a single week if a family's business was popular. It was steady, paid work for poor children in an era with few labor protections of any kind. Employing a young child today as a paid silent prop at a stranger's funeral procession would breach child labor law in Britain outright, regardless of how respectfully the job was described. Number 8, tipping off the resurrection men. Undertakers, sextons, and gravediggers were often the first to know exactly when and where a fresh body had gone into the ground, and a well-placed bribe could turn that knowledge into a steady side income. A network of informers fed information to body snatchers about newly filled graves, sometimes even the condition and size of the corpse, since certain bodies commanded higher prices from anatomy schools desperate for cadavers. This was not a rare betrayal by a rogue individual. It was routine enough that trust in the funeral trade collapsed across entire cities during the worst years of the practice, since families could never be certain the very people burying their relative were not also selling directions to the grave. Passing confidential burial information to a third party for profit today would be a straightforward breach of professional duty, and in the context of the original trade, outright conspiracy to commit a crime. First pattern break. Everything so far involved undertakers working the system quietly from the shadows. What comes next is what ordinary families were forced to do openly, in public, simply to keep their own dead safe. Number 7, arming yourself to guard a grave overnight. With body snatching at near epidemic levels in the early 1800s, grieving families frequently took turns keeping an armed vigil beside a freshly dug grave for the first few weeks after burial, the exact window when a corpse was still valuable enough to steal. Some communities formed formal watching societies with rotating shifts and built stone watchtowers overlooking the cemetery specifically for this purpose. Confrontations between watching parties and body-snatching gangs occasionally turned into actual gunfights, complete with volleys of gunfire exchanged over open graves in the dark. A modern family staking out a cemetery overnight armed with firearms to prevent a hypothetical crime would themselves be committing a serious criminal offense today, regardless of how sympathetic their motive. Number 6. Protecting a corpse with an iron cage instead of the law. For families who could not stand watch personally, the alternative was a mort safe, a heavy iron or iron and stone contraption of rods and locked plates placed directly over a coffin to physically prevent it from being dug up before the body decomposed past any resale value. Churches and cemeteries actually rented these devices out for a fee, since a single mort safe could be removed and reused on a new grave every few weeks once the previous occupant was safely beyond a resurrectionist's interest. Some parishes formed dedicated societies purely to purchase and manage a shared supply of mort safes, charging annual membership dues to families who wanted guaranteed access whenever a death occurred in their household. Building or purchasing a private security cage to bury with a loved one because you did not trust the state to prevent a specific, well-known crime says everything about how absent formal law enforcement actually was in this part of Victorian life. Today, protecting a grave is the legal responsibility of the cemetery and the police, not a private arms race between families and criminals. Number 5. Selling unclaimed bodies without a shred of consent. The Anatomy Act of 1832 finally gave medical schools a legal alternative to resurrection men, but the new supply came almost entirely from workhouses, prisons, and hospitals, meaning the unclaimed bodies of the poor could be legally handed over for dissection with no consent from the deceased or their family ever required. Undertakers and parish officials involved in workhouse burials were directly positioned to identify and funnel these bodies toward anatomy schools, effectively making poverty itself the deciding factor in whether your corpse belonged to your family or to a lecture theatre. It solved the body-snatching crisis almost overnight, but it did so by formalizing exactly the same lack of consent the public had been rioting against for decades, just with official paperwork attached. Modern law, under the Human Tissue Act, requires explicit consent before any body or body part can be used for research or education, making this entire pipeline illegal to operate today, no matter how administratively tidy it once looked. Second pattern break. The next 3 are not about bodies being stolen or sold. They are about what undertakers did or were expected to do to the living family members standing right in front of them. And it gets more uncomfortable from here. Number 4, testing for death with a hot poker instead of a doctor. Fear of premature burial ran deep enough in Victorian Britain that undertakers developed a personal repertoire of crude tests to confirm death before sealing a coffin, including pins driven under fingernails, tongues pulled forcefully with metal forceps, and occasionally a hot iron pressed briefly against the skin to check for any reflexive response. None of these methods required a medical qualification, and undertakers, not doctors, were frequently the last people to physically confirm that a person was actually dead before burial proceeded. Some coffins were fitted with bells on a cord running down to the corpse's hands specifically because families did not trust anyone's death test completely, undertaker included. Performing any of these procedures on a body today without qualified medical oversight would violate both public health law and basic professional standards for handling human remains. Number 3, laying out the dead in the family kitchen with no training at all. Before funeral homes existed as a concept, the entire embalming and preparation process happened inside the deceased's own house, often on a folding cooling table set up in the front parlor or kitchen, carried out by local women, known simply as layers out of the dead, who worked without any medical training, sanitary regulation, or oversight whatsoever. These women washed, dressed, and prepared bodies for viewing using whatever methods had been passed down informally through their own community, sometimes including the same arsenic-based fluids undertakers used, mixed and applied in a domestic kitchen alongside the family's actual food preparation area, often by the very next morning. It was intimate, community-based, and completely unregulated, which meant standards varied wildly from one town to the next. And a woman's reputation for the work was built entirely on word of mouth rather than any formal qualification. Preparing human remains today, anywhere near an active kitchen, without licensed mortuary equipment and trained hands, would violate public health and environmental regulations that did not exist for most of the 19th century. Number 2, quietly profiting from suspicious burial club payouts. Working-class families frequently paid into multiple small burial clubs at once. Informal insurance schemes designed to guarantee a decent funeral rather than a pauper's grave. And undertakers were often the ones who knew exactly how many policies a deceased child had been enrolled in, since they were the ones submitting the paperwork to collect on each one. In cities like Manchester, the practice became notorious enough that a grim local saying developed about a sickly child simply being worth more dead than alive to a struggling family juggling several club payments at once. Undertakers had every financial incentive to price funerals right up to the total payout available, rather than raise uncomfortable questions about why a household had insured one small child several times over, since a bigger funeral meant a bigger bill and a bigger fee for their own trouble. Today, an undertaker who tailored a funeral's cost specifically to maximize a payout while staying silent about a suspicious insurance pattern would be facing far more than a professional inquiry. And finally, number 1, burying people without a doctor ever confirming they were dead. For most of the Victorian era, no law required a qualified physician to examine and certify a body before burial could proceed, which meant an undertaker's own judgment, or a family member's, was frequently the only checkpoint between a very sick or unconscious person and a sealed coffin. Registration reforms slowly tightened this over the century, introducing formal death certificates and registrars, but for decades, the entire chain of custody from deathbed to graveside could run through people with no medical qualification at all, sometimes deciding within hours whether a body was ready for the ground. This is precisely why bell-fitted safety coffins, hot poker tests, and armed graveside vigils all existed simultaneously. Because everyone in the system, undertakers included, quietly understood how thin the safeguard actually was and built their own private workarounds around that gap. Modern British law requires a registered medical practitioner to certify cause of death before any burial or cremation can legally take place, closing the exact gap that made every other item on this list necessary in the first place. Every one of these practices was ordinary trade knowledge, taught the same way any craft was taught, master to apprentice, without a hint of scandal attached at the time. What changed was not the undertakers. It was the law finally catching up to how casually a corpse, and sometimes a living person mistaken for one, could be handled by people with no oversight at all. We like to imagine the Victorians as simply eccentric about death. The undertaking trade says otherwise. It says an entire profession operated for decades in the gap where medicine, law, and basic consent had not yet arrived. Tell me which number you found most unsettling, and if you want the follow-up on what actually happened inside a Victorian funeral parlor once the family left the room, say so in the comments, because that story gets stranger than this one.